All right, good evening, everyone. I am Carmen Bishop in the Zoning Administration Division. It's 7 o'clock. I'll probably try to talk a little slowly here at the beginning to give folks time to join in. I see we only have 10 so far in the meeting, and some of us are staff. But anyway, I would also like to introduce Janan Cato. Janan is also in Zoning Administration. There's Janan. And Janan will be helping to moderate this session this evening. And also Bill Mayland, Assistant Zoning Administrator, and Leslie Johnson, Zoning Administrator. And so I am going to start off with some slides. And while I'm going through the slides, please keep your microphones muted. There will be plenty of time for questions and comments after this presentation. You are certainly welcome to use the chat function as we move along. And we'll try to be sure to capture and respond to questions that are posted in the chat. We might not read all comments because everyone can read those as we go along. Now, we are recording this meeting, and we will post the recording as well as the slides afterwards. The review of data centers began following a board matter of last May, and based on the direction of that board matter between May and January, an interagency staff team researched data centers. We held meetings with various stakeholders. We held a community meeting, and we presented at Planning Commission and board committee meetings. And that work resulted in the January 9th report that's posted on our website. And then following that, there was a discussion at the board's Land Use Policy Committee meeting of March 12th, and that was about near-term enhancements that could be made to the zoning ordinance to strengthen the standards for data centers. And then following that, that was put into a board matter that was approved on March 19th that directed staff to start work on a zoning ordinance amendment and to bring that amendment to the board by July. And that zoning ordinance amendment is the subject of this meeting. We have prepared draft text for discussion purposes, along with the summary of that text, and that is posted on the project webpage. And then I'll be walking through that draft text in this presentation. Following the community meetings, of which this is the second, next steps will include a PC Infrastructure Committee meeting on May 9th, a Planning Commission public hearing on June 5th, and a Board of Supervisors public hearing on July 16th. So for our review, we are focusing on buildings where all or most of the structure is designed for the principal use of a data center with the purpose of housing computer servers and their network connections. Data centers come in various business models, and as these photos show, they vary in size and appearance. And the technology is continuing to evolve as well. Data centers can range in size from maybe 30,000 square feet to 500,000 square feet, and they can be developed in individual buildings or in a campus style, and they can employ different cooling and other technologies, which can influence potential land use impacts. It is anticipated that the demand for data centers will continue to expand because they are a critical component of our modern digital lives. And I am not going to go into a lot more information about data centers in this presentation, but if you're interested, there is a lot of background information on data centers and topics related to their potential impacts in the January 9th report that I mentioned is posted online. Now, currently, the data center does allow, the zoning ordinance allows data centers by right in C3 and C4. Those are office districts, but only up to 40,000 square feet in size. Also in the I2 and I3 industrial districts, up to 80,000 square feet in size. And then in all four of those districts, a larger size is allowed with repurposing of an existing building or with special exception approval. Data centers are also allowed in I4, I5, and I6, and also in certain planned districts if they're shown on the approved development plan. Now, in addition to the specific permissions and use-specific standards, Any use has to meet all of the zoning ordinance regulations. On this slide, you're seeing the bulk regulations for those districts where data centers are permitted. So you can see that in the industrial districts, the height is generally limited to 75 feet, and then to exceed the height, or in those certain districts where it's listed to exceed the FAR, that is allowed, but only with special exception approval. And there are other zoning ordinance regulations that apply as well, including parking, transitional screening and barriers, open space and outdoor lighting. And the county has a separate noise ordinance. The current use standards in the zoning ordinance include the size limits that I mentioned before, as well as a requirement for HVAC equipment and generators to be enclosed. And that standard does not currently apply in the I-4, I-5, and I-6 districts. Okay, now moving on to the draft text for the amendment and beginning with the permissions. Looking at the top table, you can see that SE is added for the I-4, I-5, and I-6 districts. And this pairs with the additional use standards that I'll be going over in just a minute, and would allow for certain of those standards to be modified by special exception. Now, in the lower table, you can see that we have shown the option to remove the allowance for a data center in the PRC district. And there are no existing or approved data centers in PRC. And the only other industrial uses allowed are craft beverage production and small scale production. And both of those include a customer focus that would be compatible with the town center or convention conference center areas. The text also shows the P district permissions revised to SE. And this is because some of the proffers broadly allow all or most uses that are allowed in the district. So this change would ensure that the location is specifically planned for a data center. And I want to note that as directed by the board, all the options for permissions will be advertised for consideration. The draft text also includes revisions to the standard for enclosure of the equipment. The revised standard would apply in all districts, including the I-4, I-5, and I-6. The standard also indicates that the purpose is to mitigate visual and noise impacts, and it would apply to all HVAC equipment, generators, other power equipment, as well as accessory electrical substations. And the revised standard also recognizes that certain types of cooling systems aren't mechanically feasible to fully enclose. And if that is the case, and that would be determined by the Director of Land Development Services, then a screening wall would be required instead. There are no changes to the maximum sizes in the current standards for C3, C4, I2, and I3, but the I4 district is added to that standard that would limit the by right size to 80,000 square feet. Now, an option is shown to either remove the allowance to exceed the size with by right repurposing within an existing building, or to add a maximum size for the by right repurposing, such as 200,000 square feet. No maximum size is shown for I-5 and I-6 in order to encourage data centers to locate in those heavier industrial districts. The draft text includes a setback for the building and any equipment, such as generators, from a residential lot line. The text includes a 200-foot setback, but provides for consideration of up to 500 feet. Now, the 200 feet, it's based on a review of other use-specific setbacks in the zoning ordinance, such as a barn for livestock or poultry with an agricultural operation, an extraction activity, that's a quarry, or a crematory. The text also includes a setback of half a mile from a metro station. These areas are planned for high population and employment centers. Now, both of these setbacks could be modified by SE. Of course, the zoning district setbacks continue to apply, as well as transitional screening. Transitional screening is a landscaped buffer that's required between adjacent dissimilar uses. And transitional screening was recently amended as part of an overall update to the landscaping and screening provisions. And as part of that amendment, it was increased from 35 feet to 50 feet between industrial uses and residential uses. And that 50 feet, it is the largest transitional screening yard in the zoning ordinance. To ensure that data centers are doing that upfront planning needed to make sure they will comply with the county's noise ordinance, the draft text includes submission requirements for a noise study to be submitted with a rezoning or special exception, and also before site plan approval. So this will apply to by right development as well. And it also includes a post-construction analysis that would be issued before the certificate of occupancy. The draft text also includes building design standards for by right development for a main entrance feature, facade variation, and fenestration, that is your windows and doors. And then it includes a more flexible provision that would apply with a rezoning or SE, where architectural renderings would be submitted for review. Now, here you have a diagram of what the by right standards could look like in the I-5 or I-6 district. And this is showing a 75-foot tall building, a 200-foot setback to residential, 50 feet of transitional screening, enclosure of the equipment. You can see an entrance feature on the building, as well as the fenestration that I mentioned. Now, this meeting, it is, as I said, focused on the zoning ordinance amendment for data centers as authorized by the board. But I do want to note that a separate review of the comprehensive plan policy plan is getting underway. The board has authorized staff to amend the entire policy plan with a focus on land use and environment in phase 1. And as part of that amendment, staff could include additional considerations for data centers that are reviewed through a rezoning or special exception process. The county has a website for the policy plan amendment, which you can see on the slide. And I understand initial community engagement is set to begin this month. Now, there are certain topics for which the county does not have regulatory authority to address in the zoning ordinance, such as energy efficiency or renewables, sodium and cooling water discharges, or air quality emissions. It is possible, though, that these topics will be further considered as part of the policy plan amendment. Currently, within the comprehensive plan, we do have an existing Appendix 12. It's in the land use element of the policy plan, and it has performance criteria that are used to review special exceptions for data centers for industrially planned parcels. These criteria ensure that proposals are compatible with surrounding uses and take into consideration several environmental topics. And that is all of the slides that I have. I ask that you do keep your microphones muted until we call on you, and then you can unmute and ask a question or make a comment. A couple of reminders, though. After this meeting, there are 2 more community meetings, but they will be just the same as this one. So if you're here now, you wouldn't need to attend those, but you might want to tune in for the Planning Commission Infrastructure Committee meeting on May 9th at 8:30. You can check that out on channel 16. And then, of course, we have the upcoming public hearings on June 5th and July 16th. And if any thoughts occur to you, you can always email staff at the project email that you see here on the screen. And so with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Thanks, Carmen. I'll start with a question we have in the chat from Laura. Would the comp plan supersede decisions made here, or how do the takeaways from this meeting interact with the comp plan update?
I am wondering, Laura, would you be comfortable to unmute and maybe explain a little bit more about your question? I'm not sure I quite understand.
Sure, happy to. Hi, my name is Laura Duff. I just had a quick question around if those decisions made around some of the data center items that interact with the zoning ordinance code would be captured in that comp plan, or is this discussions focused around those as well? And if we decide, or if you decide rather, on something from the information that's taken away here and the comp plan proceeds in a different direction, how do we ensure that these two items are interacting with one another?
Yeah, okay. So I think I'll take a stab at answering that. At that March 12th Land Use Policy Committee meeting, the board did indicate that they wanted, and in the following board matter that directed staff to work on this zoning ordinance amendment, the board did indicate that they wanted to really pursue some near-term enhancements to the zoning ordinance quickly. So I don't know, it is quick for us to get an amendment through in just a few months. So that's what we're working on here. The policy plan, as I understand it, I'm not in the planning division, but as I understand it, that had already been authorized. And hopefully I'm not misstating that. But that work is longer term. I can just say in theory, if something came out of that process, that would necessitate an additional review of the zoning ordinance, then I'm sure the board would want us to look at that. But I don't think we know that at this point. Does that help?
Okay, and next I'll invite Cynthia to unmute her mic.
Hi, thank you. Let me lower my hand too. Yeah, I think from what Laura was saying, that's an interesting point, given that the comprehensive plan right now has land use districts. And for example, land unit H has a 0.35 floor area ratio, but an I4 is a 0.4 and I5 is a 0.5. So does that mean that data centers can simply bypass the comprehensive plan if they're going to be by right and go directly to the 0.5, for example, in the I5 district?
So yes, yes and no. So if a property, let's say it is encumbered by proffers, maybe there's a proffered development plan or something, then they still might need a proffered condition amendment or a PCA to develop. So you could even have an I5 property that's a conventional district, but it could have proffers, it could have a development plan. And if those are not reflective of allowing a data center, then that property may need to go through a PCA process, right? So the comp plan comes into play with a rezoning, and a PCA is technically a form of a rezoning. So a rezoning, a PCA, or a special exception, all of those are going to include a review against the comprehensive plan. Now, if you have we'll just say, as you said, an I5 property, there are no proffers that limit the uses. They could go ahead and develop in accordance with that I5 district, and the comp plan would not be part of the review.
Okay, thank you. That actually wasn't my question though, but I thought I'd follow on to that. Sorry, it was just a good lead in from Laura's question, if I got her name right. Thank you. I did want to understand, I know that you guys know that the I5 districts, I4, I5, I6, we don't have many I6, but I5 in particular are highly concentrated in the Route 28, Route 50 corridor. If you just look at the county zoning viewer map, you can see clearly that that's where they are. So, so my question is, with those data centers or with those areas being close to residential, as you know, we live in the Pleasant Valley neighborhood. There's also the Meadows of Chantilly Mobile Home Park off of Route 50 here, who are also impacted by that. I was curious to know that with the amount of electricity required for a data center in any of the districts, I know I2, I3, I4 were also surrounded by, and you're limiting the sizes in those. But if you talk about an 80,000 square foot data center by right in those districts, I'm curious to understand the megawatt use of those sizes. And the reason why I'm asking is because, as we know with AI in particular, that the training servers require a lot more energy, like 5 times or something more energy. So what would normally be maybe a 12 megawatt data center in an 80,000 square foot building would become a 60 megawatt data center. And because that amount of electricity needs backup generators, you would need more backup generators. Simple formula: if you have a 3 megawatt data center or 3 megawatt diesel generator, you'd need 20 of them. So that goes also then to the amount of cooling. So I'm struggling to understand that an 80,000 square foot data center, if it's going to, as we go into the future, because it doesn't seem like we're trying to bulletproof this in any way, can use a lot more electricity and thereby a lot more HVACs, which is noise, a lot more generators, which is also noise and air pollution, and more water if they're using water cooling techniques. So I'm trying to understand, is there any room for requiring that a certain megawatts, if we're exceeding that, is there any way for us to say, well, if you're going to exceed some number of megawatts, regardless of whether you're in an 80,000 square foot building, then that should go through the process? I'm asking, really, has that been considered?
I think that's, a good suggestion. We can certainly look into that. It's my understanding that we don't have regulatory authority under the zoning ordinance relating to energy demand. So based on what I know, I'm not sure if that's possible, but we can certainly look into that. As you said, things are evolving as we go along. And, you mentioned some numbers. I certainly don't know if those are, true or not. I'll assume they are. But we definitely know that things are changing,
I
but,
do know that, let me just interject really quickly. I know that the mega data center that we had approved, in their pre-application hearing, they did say in their documentation that it was going to require 54 to 75 megawatts. So I'm not clear whether they were asked to provide that information or whether they voluntarily provided it. So what I sound like you're saying, though, is that it was probably voluntary, and that you might not be able to request or require that information. Is that correct?
Yeah. So one thing I want to point out, the proposed requirement for the noise studies, that's going to help regardless of how many megawatts, the facility is, however many square foot or megawatts. It doesn't matter how you measure the size. That is a performance-based standard, the noise ordinance. So by requiring those upfront studies, then they're going to have to show that they can and in fact do meet the noise ordinance. And I think that could be really helpful, again, regardless of the size.
Oh, and I absolutely applaud that. I think those changes have been like eye-poppingly great. That my only concern here is that we're constantly adding more substations without enabling Dominion Energy or Novec to properly forecast or plan for their electrical needs when we allow a data center that's going to exceed what they can provide. And so I thought maybe this would be an opportunity for us to provide that transparency up front.
Yeah. Now, furthering communications with Dominion, that's something that can certainly be pursued. And that wouldn't have to be in the zoning ordinance either.
Thank you.
Okay. Laura, would you like to unmute your mic?
Sure, thank you. To follow up on Cynthia's question there, I just had a question around, with the increased electrical strain on the grid and increase of water usage, how are we aligning the new zoning ordinance for data centers along with the community-wide energy and climate action plan for Fairfax and then the resilient Fairfax plan? What plans are there for that?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that. When on our staff team, when we were researching data centers, we did have folks from the OEEC, our Office of Environmental and Energy Coordination. I might have those E's mixed up on the team, and to really think about those connections. I do want to. You mentioned water, and I will say, well, I think probably. I don't know, probably everybody on this call, we've read articles about data centers that use a lot of water. And I'm sure that that could be very true in other places. But based on our local research, that hasn't been the case. Um, and, we do have that information in the January 9th report. And Fairfax Water does continue to monitor uses annually. They're always doing their assessments. And so if that should start to change, then, then of course, we need to reevaluate that. But at this point, that hasn't been the case right now. And even some of the newer data centers, they're using less water as well. So we didn't find in our research that water was a major concern. And as I mentioned, the planning for the electrical grid, that does fall to the utility companies and the SEC, and it's not a zoning ordinance item per se.
Cynthia, would you like to
Oh my
unmute?
gosh, I'm so sorry. I don't mean to dominate the conversation. I understand there are other people on the line, but certainly I just wanted to understand that we know that there are 4.7 million square feet of data centers that were approved or started construction by right since 2021. And not a single one of them yet is operational. So do we feel it might be a little premature to say that they're not affecting our water supply or they're not affecting the electrical grid? Because we know certainly that 3 substations have had to be built, and Aviator to take off, which are 2 more substations, are required to be built for 3 data centers that are again awaiting power on Route 50. So I feel like it might be a little premature to say that we
I
don't
guess,
see water
Cynthia,
electrical issues.
Cynthia, I appreciate that. I am not the water expert, but I do believe I think check out the letter if you haven't from Fairfax Water that's in the January 9th report, and they explained their methodology. And they also did touch base with Loudoun and Prince William, who have many more data centers, of course. And so the numbers were in line with that. And they do this regular planning. So that's where, hopefully for Fairfax, it's not going to sneak up on us, right? They're going to keep monitoring and stay abreast of how things are going.
Cool. And one more question then, would that also apply to air monitoring? I know that we only have 4 air monitors that the DEQ has in Fairfax County. The closest one to the whole Route 5028 where we're building data centers is 8 miles away. So are we, or is there any intention as part of maybe some of these changes to get more monitors, especially in areas where there is a high concentration of diesel generators for data centers?
Yeah, I don't know. That was something that we mentioned in the report as a step that would be outside of the zoning ordinance. That I'm not sure if that would be needed, but something that we could work with DEQ about. They do permit the generators, and
Right.
and so they are charged with the emissions side of things. And for myself, I have been glad to hear that more data centers are using the tier 4 generators. In the past, I understand that they were typically using the tier 2, and it's moving towards the tier 4, which are much better in terms of emissions. And I understand they're even quieter as well. So hopefully that's the case.
Well, through the SC process, the special exception process, I know we can ask them to do that because we certainly did with the Chantilly Premier one, and they did agree to use the Tier 4, which was great. But I'm wondering, I think what you said earlier, and I just want to clarify, was that we can't require as part of the zoning ordinance that a certain level of tier for backup generators be used. So we couldn't say you need to use Tier 4 or better, or if you can just clarify that. Thank you.
Correct. That is what I said, that the Virginia Department of Environmental Quality is charged with the permitting for emissions, and that's not something that's under the zoning ordinance.
Thank you, Carmen. We have a question in the chat. What about noise monitoring over time as well?
So noise monitor, I don't think there is any regular noise monitoring, excuse me, Elaine, but so that's something why, it could be really helpful to have these upfront noise studies done so that they're doing that planning to make sure that they are designed upfront to meet the noise ordinance. But then after the fact, the noise ordinance, like the zoning ordinance, it's enforced on a complaint basis. And then the Department of Code Compliance can go out and do the noise readings and check and see if they are in compliance.
Nothing else in the chat and no one with their hand raised yet.
It's only 7:31. All right, Cynthia.
I'm sorry, I did have to laugh out loud at myself. I'm sorry. I don't mean to dominate the conversation. I just want to make sure I have the answers to give to the community. So we did clarify that we can't ask them to have Tier 4 diesel generators unless they go through the special exception process. We also clarified that that we can't ask for megawatts that they would use unless maybe they go through the special exception process or they volunteer that information. The noise study, like I said, is great, but we also do know that lower frequency of noise does get masked by the dBA scale that the noise ordinance uses. So my question is, are there plans to update the noise ordinance, or I think you said earlier that that's a separate department, a separate thing, but do you know if there are any current plans given, the data centers have been quite in the news over the last 5 years regarding noise? Do you know if there's any plans or anyone who is looking at possibly updating the noise ordinance? Thanks.
I have not heard of any direction to amend the noise ordinance, but as I mentioned, it's a performance-based standard. So it's setting a decibel limit that would apply whether you're a data center or, a school with a rattly HVAC system. Across the board, it applies and sets certain levels. Something that I think is useful for us here in this area, if you're really interested in knowing what the impacts of a data center might be, you actually can go on a road trip, right? I mean, there's a lot of them right up there in, Data Center Alley in Loudon. And I know I personally have gone around to stand and listen, what does it sound like? And anyway, I encourage you to go ahead and if you're interested in learning more and experiencing, data centers, you can do that in Fairfax and our adjoining counties. I don't know about the low frequency. That is something that would take some additional research. I've heard that. I've read about that. I would say I haven't heard it, but I have read about it in some articles. And so that would be an additional research task.
Yeah, I think the major concern is that, certainly in the evening hours when things are quieter, that noise, because it has wavelengths of 13 to 36 feet, certainly can travel farther and around barriers. And so, people have been complaining in Leesburg, as a matter of fact, last year when one of the quantum, I think it was Quantum Lupo, went online, even though they met the noise ordinance, people were starting to complain that they were hearing hearing this horrible noise and they didn't understand what it was. So we're just obviously trying to avoid that. I know that these are smaller data centers that maybe you visited or that have been online, because we know, as Darren Shoemate, the planning commissioner, said on May 3rd, 2023, that they're no longer looking for these 12 megawatt data centers. They're looking for 100 megawatts or more. And so we know that the trend is toward these units and these buildings that are going to be hot, that are going to use more electricity, and then they're going to need to be cooled more than what we have in place right now. So it's just kind of a cautionary tale, I think, at this point, to try to make sure we are preparing for that. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Seems like people are warming up. We have a few more questions in the chat, questions and comments. Okay, so a question from Barry. Is the concentration of data centers in Northern Virginia unique? Please name the companies who own the data centers.
It is somewhat unique. There is a lot of fiber in our area, and that's why, it's not a mistake that there are a lot of data centers here. So I think this was kind of like one of the ground zero places for data centers. And that's why there are so many, and there are a lot in Loudoun in particular, and in Prince William, and not as many in Fairfax. I can't name all the ones, but I can tell you in Fairfax, we have a number of AWS, and then some others as well. We do have a list in that January 9th report in attachment 1 with the ones that were current as of that time.
Thank you, Carmen. Okay. Next, we have a question from Laura. Since data centers are often classified as critical infrastructure, are there additional considerations that would apply under zoning ordinance considerations, thinking in terms of fencing requirements or keeping them out of the 100-year floodplain, et cetera?
The fencing and floodplain requirements apply regardless of the use in the zoning ordinance, and there are standards relating to both.
Thank you. We have a question from TC in the chat. How far away from the Pleasant Valley subdivision will the data center be? We were advised in the community meetings that the distance would be half mile, but the information that you provided indicates a distance of 200 to 500 feet.
Okay. TC, this meeting, we are talking about draft text for a zoning ordinance amendment that would apply countywide. So it's not specific to any particular data center. Now, because you say Pleasant Valley, I'm going to guess that you might be referring to the recently approved Chantilly Premier data center. And in that case, I understand it was, almost a half a mile from some residential, but this is a more of a general standard. So it doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that there are any data centers planned for a particular location within 200 to 500 feet, I should say.
Right. Thank you, Carmen. We have a question from Tyler in the chat referencing the January data center report, which indicated that one option would be to provide a special exception for all districts, and that many of the recommendations in the report would be more appropriately and effectively implemented through a special exception review. So given the impact of the special exception review that we have seen been effective to provide increased protections for residents, what is the justification not to require a special exception for all districts, especially I-5?
Yes, I understand, and that the approach of requiring an SE in all districts was presented in that report. The draft text that we posted is recognizing that the desire to focus data centers into those heavier industrial districts, and that's what that text is showing you, an approach that would really try to guide them to those locations. But all of the permissions would be advertised as options for consideration as part of the amendment.
Thanks. And one clarification, I'm just curious, like whose desire is it? The county staff's desire, the board's desire, based on what? If you can elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah, I am staff. I cannot speak for the board. So I will say, as staff, we wanted to present an text that would guide data centers. They are industrial uses, and they're in that industrial classification in the zoning ordinance. And so, we wanted to focus them to go to those districts.
Thank you, Carmen. We have a question from Cynthia in the chat that Pleasant Valley is surrounded by I-3 through I-5 lots within 200 feet. So how will we be able to participate in the process if there's not a special exception?
I think that's more of a comment. You're right. If it's I-5 and I-6, the draft text would provide options for by right, and even I-3 if it's smaller. It's important to note, though, as I mentioned, if there's a proffered plan, they still may need a PCA if they want to have a reduced setback or any of those other modifications, they still may need to come. Oh, if they want to like increase height or increase FAR, they would still need to come in for an SE. So it's still possible. But, if there were a data center that could meet all of the standards, then we wanted to provide a path forward for that to happen. And I see Leslie has turned on her camera. So.
Thanks, Carmen. And I think Carmen said it well. And we allow by right, certain types of by right uses in all zoning districts. And for example, in the I-5, we allow large outdoor storage yards, where you can store a lot of equipment and materials. We allow the large fulfillment centers for Amazon by right and other kinds of warehouse use. So, I mean, those are our districts for the medium and heavy industrial type uses. So, we have to, to Carmen's point, I think the board, wanted to provide options for allowing a by right path for some of the data centers. They did talk about the I-4 a little bit because that tends to be a little of a transitional zone between the lower lower intensity industrial districts and the higher intensity. And so we do have, as Carmen pointed out in her presentation, that we do have that as an SE use for the most part, unless, if it doesn't meet the 80,000 square foot situation. And so by right uses, shopping centers are by right uses, retail sales establishments. So there is not an opportunity through a public hearing process for by right uses. I mean, site plan, if there's a site plan, there is notice requirements for the filing of a site plan, and people are allowed to provide comments, but they really have to relate to the technical, situation or the technical approval. It's not, we don't like it, and therefore you shouldn't. That's my comment. It's more, okay, it doesn't, based on what you're showing me, it doesn't meet the transitional screening yard. And so I want to point that out to you if I see something like that. So that's kind of what that notice does provide.
So I'm just going to kind of jump in and say I do see a couple comments here in the chat that, I encourage everybody to keep reading along as well. And I'm not going to read them, but I want you to know that we're seeing them, the concerns about the by right. But maybe there might be a question in there, Janan, though.
Yes, there's a question from Barry. What is the revenue effect expected from data centers for Fairfax County?
Ah, well, that is a question I can't answer. I'm sorry. I'm in the wrong department for that. I'm in zoning administration. You might need to contact the Department of Tax Administration, perhaps.
Can I just jump in real quick? Kathy Smith did respond to a question that I asked about that, and she said that the data center revenue, as far as the budget is concerned, they do not split that out from other industries. So it's just considered real estate and BPOL revenue.
I see Elaine is typing. Let's see. We will absolutely be posting the slides and the recordings for each of the meetings. So if you missed in the beginning, I'm sorry to hear that. But it will be posted, and then we have a couple more of these scheduled as well. And I want to say I do appreciate. We'll put in a link. It's the data center page. It'll be posted right underneath the meeting date.
We have a question from Cynthia Carmen. What other industry uses the kind of electricity and generates the type of noise that data centers use, or that data centers make 24/7? You're aware of any other industry uses that?
Yeah, so I am not aware of any other uses that use the same amount of energy. But I think we've covered that before. That's not something that we can write a zoning ordinance requirement related to. And the noise ordinance, also that is a performance-based standard. So they would be subject to it just like any other use. And while data centers certainly have extensive cooling systems and generators and things that can be loud, I think we've probably all experienced. I've also experienced like small things that are exceptionally loud, like maybe a poorly maintained HVAC system for a school that happens to be near where I live, for instance. So I think that performance-based approach, is a good way to go, and having the studies done so that they are putting in the right types of equipment to meet those standards is really important.
Barry's typing. No other questions so far.
Well, and I do want to, I appreciate everybody, taking time out of their evening to join us, and we appreciate all the comments. And we will be about 2 weeks before the Planning Commission public hearing, we'll be posting a staff report with proposed text.
Can I just ask really quickly, so will any of the information that either we provide tonight as citizens or that we share with you through the email, will any of that be considered, or are you just providing information to say this is what we're going to do?
No, we definitely, there can be changes made sometimes between, draft text that we come out with and then what we actually propose. So there could be changes. I just think it's part of the process, and we do appreciate, your coming out and giving us your feedback.
We have a question from Tyler. Did staff consider creating a special district for data centers, I-7 perhaps, that would then require a rezoning process allowing public input similar to a special exception?
No. I don't know. I hate to say it that way, but we actually haven't thought of that. But we can think about that. I'm sorry. This is what's great about these meetings. sometimes somebody comes up with something where it's like, wow, I had not thought of that.
That credit goes to my husband, Brian, who's on the call with me. So props to him.
Question from Diane, is the appearance of the data centers being addressed at all? They are usually square concrete boxes.
Yes, they are square concrete boxes, and we agree as staff that we have shown some standards that would apply by right. By right standards do need to be objective so that they can be implemented through the administrative approval process. We have a standard about a main entrance feature, having facade variation, and as well as having fenestration. So, you know, in the case of our concrete boxes, you know, they might need to be fake windows, but some kind of fenestration to try to dress it up. And then for those that are going through the rezoning or special exception, basically submission requirements, so that, you know, I think it's kind of like art. Everybody can look at it and see if they like it, see if it fits in that particular location. And there's also a sentence in the draft standard about a variation in massing if they are requesting like a reduced setback to residential for that.
Thanks, Carmen. Sandy, would you like to unmute your mic?
Yes, just to follow up on the aesthetics and even environmental, is it possible to require any kind of landscape associated with a data center?
Yes, so the zoning ordinance has landscaping and screening requirements that would apply to all uses. So it's basically, we have the parking lot landscaping. There's interior parking lot landscaping, peripheral parking lot landscaping, and then the transitional screening when that applies. So we do have that, and that applies across the board.
Would that include, I mean, such things as, for example, trees around a data center? Planting?
So it doesn't address foundation plantings. If that's what you're talking about, the parking lot landscaping and peripheral parking lot landscaping and transitional screening, they are required to be mostly trees that provide shade or evergreen trees for screening in the transitional screening yard. And there are open space, minimum amounts of open space required for each zoning district. But we don't really, we don't have, I think what you're thinking of, which might be like the foundation plantings. I don't think we have a standard for that in the zoning ordinance.
As part of the buffer, more or less a buffer zone with some kind of landscaping is what I was thinking.
Yes, that's the transitional screening. That's just what we call it, the transitional screening, but that's the buffer. And it would have to be between, it depends on the use that's next to it. It would need to be 50 feet next to any kind of residential, or 25 feet next to commercial or institutional uses.
Thank you.
Good question. And you would think they would require trees because of heat.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, we have a question in the chat from Laura. Does lighting / uplighting fall under that screening regulation as well?
The zoning ordinance has a separate section that addresses outdoor lighting, and it would apply to a data center like any other use. So the lights would need to be, there's a maximum color temperature standard, and they would need to be full cutoff and mounted horizontal to the ground unless they're motion activated and so forth.
We also have a question from Cynthia in the chat. Would you consider a special exception approval if it's not feasible to enclose HVACs etc. We have concerns on just director approval.
Yeah, so this question did come up at the earlier meeting, and I can circle back with Land Development Services on this, but and I'm just going to admit I'm not an engineer, but when I spoke with the engineers, it seemed that they were quite clear on which when it's mechanically feasible and when it's not. But that's something that I can certainly look into.
I'm sorry, can you expound on that? They said when it's mechanically feasible and when it's not. Can you give us a general idea about that?
Yes. So what for an example was that a cooling tower can't be fully enclosed. So they wouldn't enclose that in, something that we might call, a building or anything. But it could be screened, and so they have the screening walls. But I can certainly follow up on that.
Thanks so much.
Any questions? Would anyone like to speak up and raise their hand or input their question in this chat? Cynthia, would you like to?
I'm sorry, I just wanted to wrap up. I guess in the end, we should be sending any emails directly to what email address, just to make sure everybody is aware of that, and just where we should and how soon we should try to send our comments.
Yes. So, and we will.
Email.
Yeah, we'll put the email in the chat, and it's on the project webpage. So for emailing staff, if you can use that email address that Janine put in, that's what we're using for this project.
And I'm sorry, can you give the deadline, please?
Oh, I mean, any time is fine. The public hearings are scheduled for June 5th before the Planning Commission. And about 2 weeks before that, we will publish a staff report. And then the Board of Supervisors public hearing is scheduled for July 16th. Well, I just want to thank everyone again for taking, time out from your evening. And thank you for all your great thoughts. And I guess that's it for tonight. But if you think of anything, please email at that email address. Thanks. Bye. I'm going to remember to turn off the recording this time.
Thank you both.